One's life begins to change when their desires transform into concrete actions. You're listening to the Desire to Be podcast, where your desires for your life and relationships become your mastery. I'm your host, Devora Goldberg, and thank you for joining. Welcome to another beautiful episode of the Desire to Be podcast. I'm really excited because on today's show, my guest today is Jen Stark. Jen is going to give us a positive twist, her own twist on our Jewish educational system. Before we get into it, Jen is a dear friend of mine, so I just want to get that straight. For those of you who don't know her yet, she's a bit more than that. She's a wife and mom to 5 beautiful boys. She's also the administrator with a Jewish day school. She's the youth programming director at her synagogue, an educational consultant, and she's a doctoral student with the University of Western Ontario. I have asked her before if she sleeps. I don't think I ever got like a good answer. She's also a positive ball of fire, ready to make change where she is needed. Welcome, Jen, to the show.
Thank you so much.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
So I am an administrator. I actually taught for 18 years in public education until I started my admin work in a Jewish day school here in Toronto. And in addition to working in multiple branches in my role, I am the director of special education and resource where I am. I also do educational consulting for clients outside of this particular educational institution. And as you said, I'm also a student, lifelong learner, always looking to grow in my field. And then I do have my hand in working with children in my local synagogue. So quite busy in that regard.
So
Mhm.
take us back a little bit to the beginning of all this. What inspired you initially to go into education?
It's a great question. I think initially I was toying with law education, and they always think, oh, teachers part time. It'll be great when you're a parent.
Hmm.
If only I knew. No, but in all seriousness, it's a real. I think it started off with just a real passion for working with children and just sort of seeing them flourish. I am the eldest of 7 siblings, so
Hmm.
with my youngest sibling being 14 years younger than me, I really had a hand in working with my younger siblings when I was a teenager. But when it came to the profession itself, I think that education is a fascinating field. It's ever evolving. And I think what's really unique about it is that we're working with children. And so it really is the next generation, right? We're building the next generation of adults. And there is something very special about empowering children who are going to be our future. So education just spoke to me really in that regard. Yeah.
When you say that education is evolving, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, people are constantly revisiting in so many different arrays. You've got your pedagogy. How do we educate and what is the right way to educate? You have your curriculum. And in Jewish education, you have your Jewish curriculum, your Jewish studies curriculum, and you have your general studies curriculum, which is essentially any curriculum that's going to align with a province or a state in the United States. So you have both that you're sort of balancing. And as educators step into either the board that you're with, or the school that you're with or the educational institution that you're with or whatever, they're constantly revisiting those expectations, those ways to teach, how to teach, and they're revisiting different questions such as is what I'm doing right? And there's 3 different questions that I like to refer to. Is what I am doing right? Is it the right thing? And then there's the philosophical perspective of how do I know what is right? So I actually credit Sharon Cruz for that, who is a scholar. But that is definitely, I think, 3 big questions that we are always asking ourselves, whether we know we're asking them or we're just sort of working with them. I think that's really, why it's always evolving.
Right. But if you're talking about, let's say, a metric and you're saying what is right, when we're dealing with children, as you know, we
Hmm.
are dealing with very different individuals. So, where do you see you getting the answer for that question when you're dealing with an individual child that has an individual problem that
Hmm.
maybe according to the pedagogy or the mainstream way of the educational system is just not working for them? What is
Hmm.
right for that child?
So that's a very good question. And I think that's where I come in. I mean, this is where I'm going to argue that being malleable, or better yet, being flexible in the classroom, learning to understand what different strategies look like and how we can actually apply those in the classroom. Before I even dive into my role as somebody who oversees special education, I think that step one is understanding that what we as educators see as right isn't always the right way. And that's a really difficult place to go because we are trained professionals. But on the other hand, we also decide how we're going to deliver material in a classroom or if we're working one on one with a child. So, learning how to scan your room and getting to know each child is really, really important, and also being able to become familiar with not just one way to deliver information or one way to explore things. There are a variety of ways to explore information. We call that the universal design for learning,
Mhm.
and being comfortable with bringing that into your space. Again, no matter where you are, whether you are at a synagogue and you're working with children on just understanding the Jewish Sabbath, or whether you're talking about literally a classroom and you're finding different ways to dive into Chumash, or whether you're really exploring math and English. There are so many different ways that, because our brains are not designed to gather it all in one way, there's so many different types of learners. And so when we are not just aware, but we're in tune with our students and our children, that is what helps to uncover their full potential.
It's interesting because as you're speaking, I'm thinking you're in special education. And if you
Yes.
think about it, even a child who is mainstreamed in the classroom, if you
Hmm.
look around the classroom, 16, 17, 20 children, they are all so different. And I can imagine that teachers these days, they're all special educational teachers. Because if you really honed into your students, you realize how different each one is and what could you do as a teacher to make a difference if one child is standing out, or this one is ahead of the class, but they need something to challenge them, or this one is really mainstream, but they really need extra help. That must be such a challenge for the
Yeah.
teachers these days.
It is. It is. And quite often you'll hear that educators feel like manpower makes a difference. The more hands I have in my classroom, the easier it
Mhm.
will be,
Mhm.
because sometimes you want to just deliver your material and be able to move forward. But I'm definitely going to argue, just from my professional opinion, that
Mhm.
it's not just about the number of individuals that you have supporting students, but it has to really do with how you choose how many different avenues you make available for one area of content. So, allowing students to dabble in an array of different activities in order to do that. It does take more planning on any educator's time, but you'll find that the end result is much more successful.
Tell us why you went into consultancy.
Oh, I went into consultancy because originally, when I was working in public education, I started doing educational consulting for students in the Jewish day school system. And there
Mhm.
was a variety of different schools. So it had to do with student advocacy, parent advocacy. There was some direct work with students one on one. And it was really helping to build the learning skills component for students, especially students who struggle. So they didn't necessarily have any formal diagnosis when it comes to special education. But generally speaking, a lot of the students I worked with and a lot of the families that I worked with did have children with diagnoses. There was this need to improve self esteem in the students, try to help remove stigma, which
Mhm.
had to do with the fact that you have a child with a diagnosis. Is that okay? And it is
Mhm.
absolutely okay. And then what it also did was help the children really feel like they can flourish irrespective of what I would like to call a difference. I know that in the past we always refer to it as deficit, but I like to refer to it as a difference. And when we see it as a difference and recognize that, hey, I really know what I'm doing, I just need these tools to do it, then what that does is it actually builds on their ability to perform
I'm
and to feel good
curious.
about.
Yeah, and I'm curious if there have ever been children who have received a diagnosis and through proper help and intervention, they've gone over it, or if they've or it's not there anymore. Does that happen?
So that's a tricky question. I don't think that it ever disappears, but what happens is they learn how to manage with it, positively cope with it. And yeah, There are 2 I have a number of stories, but 2 specific ones that come to light. One with a child who is younger and one with a child who is now preparing to go to high school.
Go for it. I love stories.
The first one has to do with a child that has been monitored since the child was in preschool.
Mhm.
Reading was a real challenge both in Hebrew and in English. Repetition didn't always work. There were so many questions centered around, is it a focus issue, attention issue? Is there a learning disability involved? What could it be? When I got involved in my work, what's amazing is that eventually, after multiple years of intervention, we discovered that it was possible that the type of intervention the student was receiving wasn't sufficient
Mm.
or might have been part of the problem. So, along with both a psychoeducational assessment to determine what the areas were that needed to be targeted, along with a change in the type of reading intervention that the student was receiving, the child has begun to make steady growth, specifically in the area of reading and writing. It is such a beautiful thing to see. And again, the growth is slow and steady, but there is growth. So, one of the things that we stay away from is asking whether the student is at grade level, because when you're looking at a child with a deficit or a difference, you have to monitor growth and you have to look at it on a graph and you have to be able to plot that. Say, well, is the child where the child was last year or six
Mhm.
months ago?
Right.
And as long as we see growth, we know that the child is making progress. To see that child now be able to feel good about what that child is doing and be able to observe the child working and actually have such a beautiful relationship. I credit the team that works with this child because number one, it takes believing in the child and saying that there was a point where everybody was like, well, now what? But we said, no, it's not now what, it's what now. Let's figure out where we're gonna go.
Hold on a
And
second. We're not saying now what, which is
right,
like you're basically throwing up your hands, you're
right.
at the end of the line. You change that to what now? What
Yeah,
other direction do we turn into
ex
at this fork in the road
yeah.
and find another solution? That is brilliant. I'm gonna steal that. I'm just telling you. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so this has been so special, and I feel that by the time this child graduates, and I have said to this individual's intervention team, "You're in it for the long haul, but you're gonna be at that graduation and you're gonna be cheering the loudest." So, I mean, it's an amazing thing to watch. The second student that I'm thinking about is a child who really had difficulty coping on so many levels. Again, also pursued a psychoeducational assessment, which I don't not going to recommend that that's always the place to go. But it discovered that this individual had a slightly more severe disability. But again, we said if our team can figure out where we're going to go with it, let's see if we can actually help this child to continue to grow.
Mm.
Now, ultimately, there was a big question mark centered around whether or not this child would go to a Jewish high school. What's it going to look like? I mean, we know that resources in independent schools, in any independent school, Jewish, not Jewish, whatever, are sometimes limited because in Ontario we don't necessarily receive government funding. We
Mhm.
don't receive government funding, but ultimately, this child is moving on, and this individual is flourishing. The student is really, really excited about the next path that the student's going to go. And we're just so proud of all the work because you see a motivated, committed, positive attitude. And
Tell
that
us
is
a bit
huge.
about yeah, just wanna jump into what was the pain point with this student that now you see a difference in?
So I mentioned the psychoed assessment, and I think that sometimes that information, not sometimes, a lot of the time, it really is so important because it gives a full profile on a student.
Mhm.
So when you have an intervention team and you're still not seeing success, at times it's really trial and error. I hate to say that, but it is true. When you have the data to support or to explain what might be going on, and you read through all of that information, it gives you more to work with. And so now it's not just trial and error. Now you actually have clinical evidence to be able to turn a direction.
Mhm.
And what I think is really important with children in general is that when they hit an age, when they become really self aware, informing them of what is going on and why their brain interprets information the way that it does is actually what will help the actual turning
Mhm.
point. So sometimes when you talk about pain point in general, it could be that a child um has no awareness of what's going on, but the adults do. And that can be really difficult because the individual at the center is in the dark. So I find that with this individual that you talk about, this student was kept informed along the way and actually owns it and understands it. And by owning and understanding, this individual can manage it because eventually that is the individual who has to manage it as as the student becomes an adult.
The Desire to Be podcast is taking sponsors for upcoming episodes. If you have a business that you'd like to advertise, if you have a product that you'd like to advertise, this is the platform to do it on. It will reach all my audience members, giving you lots of great exposure. Or maybe you just want to sponsor an upcoming show and support the Desire to Be podcast. If you're interested in sponsorship or advertising, reach out to me on either LinkedIn or on Instagram. You'll find me under my name, Devora Goldberg. Thank you again for listening. But I have a question on that.
Yeah.
When we have a diagnosis, sometimes we get stuck in what it is and there's no path forward. There was a person who told me recently, I have social anxiety and therefore I cannot go into crowds. So she
Yeah.
spoke to her therapist, and I understand there's place for every diagnosis and whatever the whole detail of her case is, that's
Mhm.
fine. But not always is it a life sentence. Not always
Right.
is it, this is what I am. It's a label. So I see the benefit in knowing what you're dealing with, but how much of an emphasis do you put on that versus this is where you're going? And even with this is how you can shine.
Mhm. So I work very hard to, no matter who I'm working with, whether again as a consultant or in my field, in my formal responsibilities here, we steer away from the label itself.
Mhm.
The label is there because what it does is it identifies the symptoms. It explains, better yet, it categorizes the symptoms. That's what it does. You have all these symptoms and it fits under this criteria.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can see an overlap of symptoms. But one of the things that I focus very heavily on is essentially working to overcome the symptoms. The label doesn't really matter so much. The label is there as a category title because it explains this information, and we as professionals use that information to talk. We use it as a starting point, as a launching point.
Mhm.
I can think of actually one more story, and this is a beautiful one. This is a child who is on the spectrum, and there was a big question mark on where this child would end up in school.
Mhm.
I have to tell you that the child, you can take a label and you can say the child belongs in a special needs school, or you can say, look, there's a communication component here. We're going to need to work on teaching the student how to communicate, and we're going to intervene both proactively and in the moment. And we are going to do it with repetition. So this individual needs really clear structure and routine. Let's make sure that there is a very clear schedule for the child to follow. And let's make sure that we have a team who understands the nature of, for example, being on the spectrum and can actually appreciate the differences that go with it.
Mm.
And then what you end up having is over time, you have a student who is flourishing. And I'm not going to tell you that it is a smooth road from A to B. There are a lot of ups and downs, there are a lot of obstacles. But again, you are watching growth. So you are watching how a student evolves over time. And eventually, they do acclimatize to their environment. But again, when the team working with the individual or individuals takes the time to sincerely understand it.
Let's say a parent comes to you, they have an issue with their child. When you say you have a team, do you go into the school system and speak to the teachers and the administration? Because I'm assuming it's independent from the work that you do as an administrator. How does that pull together? And I ask you this question because if I have listeners who have a specific educational
Mhm.
question, they want to reach out to you, what can they expect?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it depends on what the families are looking to accomplish. So, generally, if a parent hires me to do that, then yes, that is correct. I will sit down, I will be a part of the meetings that take place. Some of the consultant work I do is just merely, like I said, working with the families or just working with the children
Mhm.
just directly. But there have been times where I have been part of meetings. Sometimes I'm there literally as a parent or student advocate, but also because I have a very clear understanding of how the school system works and how the curriculum expectations work and a relatively solid understanding of a variety of different maladies or neurodiversities, it's helpful that sometimes you have someone who can explain it not just to the school, but also to the parents. Sometimes the way that families hear information and how
Mhm.
they perceive it isn't necessarily how it's being delivered. So when you go in there as, sometimes as a mediator too, right? Because the goal is to ensure that everybody is partnering together, right, for the well-being of the child.
Is there a
Yeah.
specific aspect of education that you're focused on and that you feel most passionate about?
I've always been motivated by helping students uncover their full potential. Sometimes I really miss being in the classroom and working directly with the students just because it's extremely rewarding when you are watching students improve, when you're directly involved in that. But at this stage in my career, I have really grown to appreciate, and it's what I wanted to do inevitably, is really just working with staff and helping them to be able to uncover their potential as
Mm.
as educational leaders themselves. So motivating them to want to be lifelong learners and want to evolve themselves and helping them to be able to recognize when they're at a crossroads, it's okay. Let's figure out which direction you should take. When we make mistakes, it can be very, very tricky to accept because, again, we are working with children.
Mhm.
And so nobody wants to feel like they've failed a child, so to speak. But it's okay because in the moment when you think that you were doing the right thing, it's okay to say, "Hey, maybe I need to do it differently." But that's okay because when you were doing it in a different way in that moment, you felt that you were following through on best practices. And I think that helping staff not to be so hard on themselves in that moment and be able to say, "Hey, that was growth. That's amazing," right? I think that that is essentially where my direction is heading in
Are
terms of.
people open to what you present to them, that there is growth, there is change, there is another way, like, don't think like you've hit the end of the road?
I hope so. I do. I mean, based on my conversations, I would tell you yes.
Mm.
And I want to trust and believe that. I think that the more also in my doctoral work, the more that I learn, the more I share. So it's not information that I'm keeping for me or that I'm just writing and reflecting about. It's information that I bring back to everybody that I'm in contact with. I think that it's important to share that information and pay it forward. One piece of information I've really been, or one area I've been really focused on lately is the notion of unlearning. And unlearning is a process where when you recognize that you need to abandon you know, certain things that you've been doing, and it doesn't matter whether it's a policy or a pedagogy or, a program you've been using, you need to be able to go through a period of understanding why you are abandoning what you've been doing. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that we're not using it anymore. Or we have discovered that there might be a different way to do it that might give us better results. And you have to be able to validate the notion of resistance before individuals are ready to step into that new zone.
Mm.
And last but not least, it's really important to recognize that in any organization, if you want organizational growth or if you want individual growth or whatever it is you're looking at, that it's going to happen at different times for everyone even though you might be focusing on an entire organizational growth or department growth or whatever. So you have to give everybody that time to be able to have that unlearning process
Mhm.
happen so that you can now really move into authentic new learning as a team.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, where do you see our educational system, specifically in the Jewish world, because this is where you're focused? Where do you
Yeah.
see us improving and growing within the next 5 years?
So I am really hoping that in general that we grow in the area of differentiation that we grow in the area of, I would say, universal design, recognizing that one way isn't the only way.
Mm.
I hope that that does continue. I've definitely seen it in so many different schools. I would say over North America, there's a lot of amazing things happening. There's a lot of professional development organizations that are building the PD to help educators understand that better and how to use it as well. Number two, I definitely think that over the next 5 years, we're going to begin to see institutions be more accommodating to learning disabilities, behavioral disorders, and other exceptionalities. I think that as educators come to understand them better and continue to understand how the differentiated learning or the universal design for learning works, I think that we will begin to see educators feel more comfortable educating those students. And I think that parents will continue to feel a lot more comfortable with the assessment process and the diagnosis process and feel okay with that. I mean, ultimately, what we want is we want children who want to be in the Jewish school system, whose families want to be in those systems. We want to see them thriving and we want to see them accepted and we want to see that there is a space for them. And so I think that we will see an increase in that as we continue to peel away the layers of the of
If any
information.
of my listeners are listening to you and they want to reach out to you directly, what would be the best way? And if it's a number, I can just put in the show notes.
I would say email.
Mhm.
Email is the best way to reach out to me. And I'm pretty quick and efficient with that. So
You definitely
definitely.
are. To end
Thanks.
off on the Desire to Be podcast, I hone in on the specific desires that drive the individual to their greatness and to what they feel is their mission in life. It's very clear to me from this conversation where you see your direction in where you are making a difference in people's lives. I know you're within the educational system, but we're talking about people's lives and the trajectory of where they're going. What
Mhm.
would you say is your desire that gets you going, gets you moving?
My ambition, is that fair to say? I just have a desire to make a difference in this world. Does that make any sense? I
Tell
think
us more.
that my drive and my ambition to just continue, I think, being my best self is what drives me and motivates me to help others be their best self. I think that I'm an exhausting individual. I don't know that the go, go, go is for everybody. But I think what is so awesome about that element is that the more that I acquire, the more that I learn, and the more that I discover makes me want to share it with everybody that I know in the hopes that they're driven to do the same for themselves. Because I think that if each of us are striving to be our best self, um, that is really what's going to help make this world a really awesome place.
That is awesome. You are awesome. Thank you so much
You.
for joining. This was an incredible conversation. Guys, if you want to reach out to Jen, I'll drop her contact in the show notes. Jen, all the best. Ah, what a great episode. Thank you for being here. I truly, truly appreciate you. I'd love for you to tap 5 stars and let me know what resonated. Be sure to connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn under my name, Devora Goldberg. That's where I give you more content. That's where we're able to engage even further. Until next episode, stay safe and be well.